How's everyone doing today? Good? All right. It's such a lovely day outside. We should be having this conference outside, I think. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the politics of Bitcoin. So, imagine you are an inventor and you have just invented the vacuum cleaner in a world that's much like ours, except they hadn't invented vacuum cleaners yet. So you're really proud of this invention, so you go to your nearest bar, you walk in, and you see 4 people sitting in the back. And these 4 people in the back, they are discussing their political worldviews. Let's say one is a communist, one is a social democrat, one is a conservative, and the other one is a libertarian. You give them a demonstration, explain to them how it works, what the utility is, and so on. They then start discussing your invention. Is this discussion going to become political? Well, we live in an imperfect world. A world where, seemingly pretty harmless objects like beepers, cell phones, pinball machines, and most recently on Twitter, prom dresses can become objects of political conflict, struggles, and identities. But if these people were relatively rational, you would expect the conversation to focus on the technical aspects and utility of the vacuum cleaner, not so much anything having to do with their worldviews. Why? Because a vacuum cleaner is a relatively neutral object. It's not like a vacuum cleaner is somehow antithetical to the idea of being a communist, a libertarian, a conservative, or a social democrat. All right, let's say the week later, being the great inventor that you are, you invent Bitcoin. Again, you're very proud of this, almost as proud as of inventing the vacuum cleaner, maybe not quite as proud, but quite proud. So, you again walk into this bar, and you again see the same 4 people. The communist, the conservative, the libertarian, and the social democrat. And this time you start explaining to them what Bitcoin is, what you have made, how it works, and so on. Now, Bitcoin is pretty difficult to grasp, but let's say these are very highly intelligent people, and they grasp it quite well. Is this conversation going to turn political? Well, you would expect it to become so. Why? Because Bitcoin is first and foremost about politics. In fact, all the technological innovation behind Bitcoin was meant to be in the service of a very particular worldview. So if you want to understand anything about Bitcoin, you need to understand the politics behind Bitcoin. All right, so what is the worldview then that shaped Bitcoin? You can call it the crypto-anarchist / libertarian worldview. A view about the world that thinks that government should be small, that political and economic freedom are extremely important, that privacy is a fundamental human right, and that personal responsibility in society is very important. It is a worldview that generally thinks government interferes way too much in our lives, and that this is harmful in terms of political, social, and economic consequences. It is a view that is particularly critical of how monetary affairs in our society are managed, namely primarily by banks, central banks, and states. Now, there can be no doubt that Bitcoin was shaped by this worldview. But I would argue that it's still very much Bitcoin today, looking at the community, looking at the design, looking at the products, looking at the norms of governance that operate in this ecosystem, very much a juggernaut still for that worldview. There are some criticisms maybe you could leverage against this, but I think that's a pretty accurate assessment. All right, so let's think a minute, what then is so valuable about Bitcoin from this crypto-anarchist / libertarian worldview? And this is where opinions start to differ. When you're talking about the exact value of Bitcoin from this worldview, there is a difference of opinion. But in my view, it's two things. One, Bitcoin has the ingredients to become a phenomenal store of value from a crypto-anarchist perspective. A resilient asset that can retain its value in the long run. Second, Bitcoin has the potential to enable financial sovereignty in our world, giving people control back over their financial affairs. So let's look at those things more closely. What exactly are the ingredients that make Bitcoin interesting from a crypto-anarchist perspective in terms of a store of value? Well, the most obvious thing is the fact of this hard limit of 21 million Bitcoins. But there's more to it. A second key aspect here, it's very difficult to create representations of Bitcoin that function like Bitcoin. So we do this when you put your money with a third-party exchange, for instance, and you exchange your Bitcoins for Dogecoins. You're not really exchanging Bitcoins. You're exchanging representations of Bitcoins. The problem here, however, is, or the advantage of Bitcoin, is that this is in a pretty limited scope. You can't take the representation out of that exchange and start using it in other places in the ecosystem. Another aspect to this is that Bitcoin is impossible to imitate. Litecoin is Litecoin. Dogecoin is Dogecoin. Bcash is Bcash. And only Bitcoin is Bitcoin. This is a point that seems to be particularly hard to understand for economists. I am an economist myself. I'm not sure why it's so hard to understand, but there is a very clear difference between these things. So what you have is something that is extremely scarce. Another aspect about Bitcoin regarding the store of value proposition is the expectations. So Bitcoin makes a very hard promise on the production of Bitcoins in the long run. In 2140, all Bitcoins that will ever have come into existence will have been produced, more or less. That's even better than with gold or silver. In fact, there are a number of other advantages over gold and silver as well. Bitcoin is more divisible. Bitcoin is much easier transportable. And also in terms of storage, there are in fact a number of advantages in Bitcoin. All right, but we're not entirely there yet. So it has some of the ingredients, but it has still certain problems, even from a crypto-anarchist point of view. One, Bitcoin is still too volatile. Even if you think a little bit of volatility is good, Bitcoin is too volatile to be a long-term storm of value at this point in time. Two, liquidity, particularly in some places in the world, can still be very hard to liquidate your Bitcoin positions. There's a lot of chokeholds. Three, one thing that comes with a store of value is that it must be pretty easy to store somewhere and, not lose it. That's relatively okay to do if you're an expert, but for people who are not experts, they generally end up storing their Bitcoins, let's say, on a third party. All right, so this is just to say that basically the idea here is Bitcoin has some of the ingredients to becoming a store of value according to crypto-anarchist thought, but it's not entirely there yet. But you could see the appeal. Financial sovereignty. So again, here Bitcoin has some fundamental ingredients that make it very interesting. First and foremost, you can now send digital payments around the world, anywhere, relatively easily, and not have to use the banking and fiat system. That was not possible for Bitcoin, before Bitcoin. That's extremely empowering. Second, Bitcoin transactions are uncensorable. If I want to donate money to WikiLeaks, there is nothing that can stop me from doing that. Except, of course, if you put a third-party service provider in between who shall not be named. Lastly, Bitcoins, if used properly, can be extremely difficult to confiscate. If I have a piece of gold, it's pretty bulky, and I need to put it in a particular place. Bitcoin is moved or unlocked by having a secret code. I can split up that secret code, put it in different physical locations, and I can put it in, books, pieces of paper, a USB stick, whatever. So if you use Bitcoin properly, it can also be a very difficult asset for something to confiscate. So again, that's good from the point of view of the crypto anarchists in terms of financial sovereignty. Now here there are of course some issues as well. One, in order to be financially sovereign with Bitcoin, you need to have quite a bit of expertise about Bitcoin. Again, most people just keep their Bitcoins, or many people, with a third-party provider. You're not being financially sovereign then. Second, here again, there are still liquidity constraints. Third, Bitcoin is a pretty mediocre payment system. This is, something that's been a very hot topic of discussion, let's say, in the last 2 years. But anybody that espouses the crypto-anarchist view has to admit that as long as it doesn't interfere with the store of value proposition or other aspects of financial sovereignty, that the better you can use Bitcoin in terms of paying for your cup of coffee and so on, the better that is. Okay, so the point here is, why would a crypto-anarchist be interested in Bitcoin? And it's predominantly, in my view, because of these two things. Okay, it has some of these ingredients that can enable financial sovereignty, and it can potentially, according to their view, make it a very good store of value. Now, is that the only thing you can do with Bitcoin? The answer is no, right? Because Bitcoin is in fact about more than just money. You can create digital art on Bitcoin, proof of existence applications, digital playing cards, stocks, bonds. In fact, Bitcoin seems to be a new category of thing. There might be a lot of things that we haven't discovered yet about Bitcoin, right? So it's not only about money. But from the point of view of the crypto-anarchists, these are not as important. They may have some importance. ICOs, or really initial public offerings by a different mechanism, could be very interesting if done properly, also from the viewpoint of financial sovereignty. Okay? But the key here is, from the crypto-anarchist perspective, it's not that these other things are completely unimportant, it's just that the store of value and the financial sovereignty aspects, that's what's really key. And all of this, what underlies this, is really the decentralized character of Bitcoin. If you want financial sovereignty, and if you want this store of value according to this crypto-anarchist perspective, the system needs to be decentralized, meaning, because a lot of people use this word in many different ways, meaning that power over the system is distributed. Again, this is fundamentally about politics. And I am quite critical of altcoins and a lot of other things in this space. Not everything, but many things. And this is one of the primary reasons. Because it's really only Bitcoin that has this predominantly decentralized character. And a lot of that has to do with what my friend Giacomo Zucco this week called the immaculate conception of Bitcoin. Bitcoin was created at a time and brought up when people did not yet realize what this could potentially be. All right, so all of this, I think, raises a very interesting question. If Bitcoin and all the technological innovation behind it was built to service this political worldview, can you take the technology behind Bitcoin and separate it from that political worldview? Just like a libertarian, a communist, a social democrat, and what was the other one I said, a conservative, can all use a vacuum cleaner, can you use the technology, the main innovations behind Bitcoin, and put them in the service of some non-political or maybe a different political end? Well, to a lot of people, the answer is obviously yes. To me, it's not obvious at all. So let me dismiss one idea. This idea of using the technology behind Bitcoin for enterprises. That is a very misleading characterization of what companies like mine do in that space. What we are doing is we're building business-to-business ecosystems, distributed business networks that can have a lot of value in terms of managing regulations, in terms of unlocking new business models, in terms of process optimization, and so on. And we do indeed use something which somewhat, resembles a shared ledger, but in a closed environment with very different properties and for very different purposes than Bitcoin. So it's really a mischaracterization to say that we're using a technology behind Bitcoin to build enterprise applications. In fact, we should stop using the description of blockchain technology for enterprises altogether, I think, because it's very misleading. It's very removed from what we are actually doing. All right, so now having put that aside, what then really is innovative about Bitcoin? What is really technically innovative about Bitcoin? And how does that relate to the political end? So, pick up almost any book about Bitcoin. Talk to almost anyone, and the first thing they will tell you that what is technologically innovative about Bitcoin is solving the double spending problem without a central authority. So the double spending problem being this idea that if you have a digital money, right, just like if I have an MP3, that you can make copies of it and spend it infinitely. That problem. Banks solve this problem every single day, with millions and millions of transactions. And they solve it by being a trusted third party. The only reason, in my view, why you would want to actually solve this problem in the way that Bitcoin does is precisely to promote this worldview. Because otherwise, it's just an extremely inefficient way to solve this problem. Second, what's also interesting about Bitcoin, the regulation of ownership through smart contracts. And by this I don't mean smart contracts in the way that's usually used, that term, within enterprises. So when we talk about smart contracts in enterprise application, what we're talking about is basically highly automated, creation, execution, and storage of agreements within a legal framework. The way Nick Szabo originally coined the term was as something that regulated ownership outside the existing legal framework. So again, that is very much related to the crypto-anarchist worldview and difficult to remove from it. Very interesting as well, very innovative. Bitcoins are produced via a protocol in exchange for a very important service called mining. Again, this very much harks back to the idea of gold, which was traditionally seen as the primary store of value asset for crypto-anarchists. Again, something very much related to this political worldview, right? If you're okay and on board with states and banks controlling our money supply, then what would be innovative about a protocol that produces that money for you? 4, an open financial system. Bitcoin is accessible for everyone around the world. Now, many people can kind of get on board with that idea, that would be good, because there are billions of people around the world who are excluded from financial services. But the way that Bitcoin solves that problem is by bypassing regulatory and legal frameworks. Again, very much part of the crypto-anarchist philosophy. Bitcoin is a global settlement system. That's very unique. You can send a Bitcoin transaction and it will be settled within about 1 hour. If you try to do this in the regular banking system, particularly if you're sending your money to faraway places, that's something very much to envy. But again, the way that it solves this problem is very much according to this philosophy. Banks are also trying to create instant settlement or close to instant settlement, but the way they're going to do that is through things like SEPA, the Single European Payment Area. They're not going to do it by creating this decentralized system. Permanent storage records. That's also pretty fascinating about Bitcoin. Once you put something in and it stays in a blockchain long enough, it's nearly impossible to take out. Not impossible, because if everybody agreed, let's throw away the last 100 blocks and start over from that block, that's possible, but it's extremely unlikely. So for all practical purposes, it's a permanent data store. Now again, this could have all kinds of applications, but the way that is brought about and the reason why that thing is permanent is, again, very much because of this decentralized character to Bitcoin. So, my remarks here aren't meant to be per se conclusive. They're more suggestive. But thinking about this, thinking about what Bitcoin is, and thinking about what is really technologically innovative about Bitcoin, I am of the view and of the intuition that really, unless it's in the service of this worldview, there isn't really much technically that you can take behind it and put to use elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Thanks. Hey, so I get the feeling you're really, I'm also new to the space, but the term people usually would use would be like a Bitcoin maximalist. That's what I'm feeling. That doesn't matter what the terminology is, but I honestly think there is space in the space for all the other coins and applications for many different reasons. But let's say that's not the case, or actually, what do you feel will be happening in the next 5 years or 10 years? I mean, I don't see an ecosystem with 15,000 tokens surviving. That makes sense. I do feel there will be several, stronger ones that do survive, but in that sense, Bitcoin would not be the only store of value. But I don't know, I'm just wondering what your thoughts on this are. Like, what do you expect in 5 to 10 years? Will all the other coins die out? Will Bitcoin be the only store of value? I mean, I know your talk is not about that, but I'm just curious about it.
Sure. So people often want to say that Bitcoin is something like the MySpace of this ecosystem, right? I don't think it is. I think we've already had the MySpaces. We've had 30 years of experiments with things like e-gold that finally led to Bitcoin, which, in my view, is probably going to be the Facebook of this ecosystem. If you currently look at what is happening in this ecosystem, altcoins aren't catching up. Bitcoin is getting further away from them. If you look at terms of number of products, liquidity, infrastructure, governance, the decentralized character, the community, the developers, innovation, and so on, Bitcoin is only distancing itself from these altcoins. Now, does that mean I think there will be no other tokens in this space? No, not per se. So, for one, there might be certain kinds of reasons why you might want to issue certain tokens on top of Bitcoin. So that's one reason. Like I said, I think ICOs could actually be interesting if implemented correctly. I don't think it's generally implemented correctly, but it could be. That said, there probably all are, things like Litecoin, Monero, and so on, I do see a number of these tokens also surviving. But I do think that Bitcoin is going to be the dominant one. And if Bitcoin fails, I would say that probably the rest of this ecosystem goes down with it. I don't think that if Bitcoin fails that anything else is going to replace it, or at least not very quickly. At least not very quickly. Because a lot of where Bitcoin is, again, it's because of that immaculate conception. It's because it was able to be raised and is relatively isolated, which is kind of, ironic given the whole open character of the system. But in the first few years, in this rather isolated system. So that's my view. That's my view on that. Yeah.
We have another question here.
This is a question slash statement, but I didn't get to hear your whole presentation, so you might have covered it. Version 1 of almost every platform or technology inevitably fails and is taken over by version 2, who happens to learn the mistakes of version 1. So it appears the same goes with Bitcoin. Bitcoin actually is not outrunning the altcoins, it's the other way around. You look at I hate to use the term market cap because it's inaccurate, but the market price aggregate of Bitcoin relative to everything else went from 100% down to about 35.9% currently. And Bitcoin also has a structural deficiency, which is this governance issue, which is why you haven't had the technical problem solved in Bitcoin, despite the fact it's been several years since multiple solutions have come to fore, such as a throughput issue, et cetera, Lightning Network. Compare that to the offshoots of Bitcoin, Dash, et cetera, Ethereum, and you can see they're moving much, much quicker. And it's not because Bitcoin's inferior, it's because of the structural deficiency in governance. You know, there's a lot of bickering in Bitcoin, but there's not as much implementation and solution compared to practically all the competitors. Agree?
No. And in fact, is that a question or is it a statement?
Agree is a question. Okay. The rest of it was a statement.
No, so I have a different perspective on that. So I think it's fundamentally flawed to look at the prices of these things, right? So if you look historically, railroad stocks in the 1850s, the IPO craze at the end of the 90s, a lot of things started kind of bubbling to the top. So if you only look at the prices of these things, it's not going to be a very accurate reflection. But if you look at the fundamentals, number of products, liquidity, interest, brand name, security in terms of mining power, innovation, the number of developers, the decentralized character of the ecosystem, and so on, I just don't think, I think Bitcoin is only expanding its lead. So I think we okay, he didn't like the answer, I think. So I think we fundamentally disagree here. It could be that it's certainly true that Bitcoin may not have been, in hindsight, perfectly designed. That might be true. So, all this stuff about the block size, in hindsight, we probably should have just put the block size at 3 megabytes to begin with. The problem is we chose 1 megabyte, and it's now very difficult to change that. But, the key to these technologies is not per se that the best one succeeds. It's the one that works well enough, which has the most momentum behind it, that succeeds. And the problem is with all these altcoins, they just don't really offer enough innovation on top of Bitcoin to really take that prize. And again, they're very much dependent and reliant on Bitcoin in all kinds of number of ways. The only exceptions that I might think of here, so if you take something like Monero, which I also find quite fascinating, and has basically privacy built into the core protocol, which is something that probably won't be able to be implemented in Bitcoin. You'll probably only be able to do that on top of Bitcoin. That might be, something particularly valuable that Bitcoin won't be able to do. That might mean that, something like Monero would indeed have this reason to stay around in the long term, and probably will develop some kind of symbiotic relationship with Bitcoin, right? But mostly, I think the name of the game here is Bitcoin. Yeah.
Thank you, Jan. We have another question here in the audience.
Hi. So I agree the connection of Bitcoin to sort of this underlying philosophy of you know, in some form, anarchism. I'm curious what your view is on, you know, a couple years out or whenever it happens where the Bitcoin becomes less of a sort of, I think to a lot of world governments, it's still kind of a novelty. It's kind of like a new thing, and it's interesting, and they're starting to regulate it, but it's not seen as really a threat to their power. Like they're not really conceptualizing it as like an existential worry. But I'd assume you think that that might happen at some point, that there's going to be this this butting heads of like who controls what happens now. Like, is it the decentralized system or is it the centralized system? I'm curious first, when do you think that's going to happen, if you had to guess, and also what does that conflict sort of look like?
So one thing, so we recently in February in the Netherlands had the Standing Committee on Finance discuss Bitcoin with a number of experts. One thing that I found interesting about this discussion is that they were generally dealing with this as a very kind of technical administrative topic. Bitcoin was designed not just with a particular view in mind, but to also be very resistant to changing what it actually is. Bitcoin is kind of like this viral thing that has certain values and properties built in it that are extremely difficult for people to grab a hold of. So there's going to be a conflict. In fact, there already is a conflict with the existing political order. Why? Because it wants to change that political order and was designed to be a weapon in changing that political order. So what's going to come out of that? I'm not really sure. It's very hard to predict. But if Bitcoin is really going to be successful, it is at least to some extent going to change, you know, what that political order is.
Thank you. We have a last question here from the CEO of BTC.com.
I'm familiar with him.
Yeah, hi. I'm not the CEO, but okay. So, like in December of last year, we saw the price of Bitcoin increase a lot, and we also saw the amount of fees increase a lot.
Yeah.
To the point where it would cost 50 euros to send 10 euros in Bitcoin. I think if the price of Bitcoin continues to rise, and we're going to see that same issue again, will that hurt Bitcoin? Or the question is, do you think Bitcoin will survive if the price of the fees continue to rise, like, and no one's going to be able to use it?
So in the white paper, in the Bitcoin white paper, it says that eventually fees will have to replace the mining rewards. So for your security, you're going to be pretty limited unless you can, you know, believe you can increase the block size to a very large degree. These prices are going to continue to increase, right? Bitcoin transactions on the basic protocol level are probably going to turn out to be very, very expensive. That's actually a good sign, because it means people actually want to use it, and it actually means that the thing is secure. Can you increase the block size? I think it's quite dangerous. I think it's possible, but you will never be able to scale and keep this decentralized character of Bitcoin just by increasing the block size. So, you know, I mean, you think about something like Visa that does 50,000 transactions per second. There is no way to put 50,000 transactions, in my view, in Bitcoin, right, and remain secure. So if you want to also use these things for payments, which I have said is a good thing, then you need to build them on the second layer in a way that is, you know, reliable and is sort of in line with the philosophy of Bitcoin. I think there is potential to do that through things like the Lightning Network. There are things you can do within the basic protocol itself, like Schnorr signatures and so on. But in the end, you're going to have to build out these layer 2 solutions. Now, where I could be wrong, and this would be, it wouldn't be the first time I was wrong about something. And this is where altcoins could play a role. If it is indeed the case that you cannot build a second layer on Bitcoin, then there would be, which I think you probably can, but if you can't, then there would be more space for altcoins. So then there could, as long as they're somehow pegged for their security to Bitcoin, right? And then again, you get the question, maybe it's side chains or something like that. Maybe there's a different way of doing that per se than doing it that way. So the answer is yes. If this happens again, I think that probably will give fuel to, let's say, the altcoin fire. But looking long term, I would expect Bitcoin to largely be able to deal with these issues. But if I'm wrong about that, then there may be, better opportunities for altcoins than I've just described. Yeah.
Thank you, Jan, for your point of view on
Okay.
Bitcoin.
All right. Thank you.